Welcome to the Medical Science Reviews podcast. Here we discuss scientific topics in medical science, biomedical research, and daily life topics that have an impact on our health. Take a quick second and hit the subscribe button below so you can be notified when we have more videos like this, which include videos about scientific careers, medical science, reviews in immunology, pharmacology, cancer research, and many topics in clinical medicine. My name is Rogério Figueiredo. I'm an associate professor at the Faculty of Medicine in the University of Turku in Finland. I have a PhD in immunology and microbiology. And this podcast is not part of my teaching and research activities at the University of Turku, but is part of my personal desire for teaching and effort to bring you free access to reliable scientific knowledge and how you can implement this knowledge to improve your life. So today, let's talk about mood disorders and immune response. Or more specifically, let's discuss how subsequential events that trigger negative emotions in our lives could not only impact our emotional stability, but as a consequence, could negatively impact the functional structure of our immune system, which would make us more vulnerable, for example, to infection or chronic disease such as cancer. Have you noticed that in a short period of roughly 6 years, we have been inexhaustibly exposed to negative news that bring fear? When one negative event or circumstance ends, another emerges in an endless cycle that triggers a constant signal of negative emotions. So whether it is fear of a prelude of economical crash as a consequence of Brexit or the US elections, or fear of terrorist attacks, fear of a unique, epic, precipitous pandemic for more than 2 years, which filled the spectrum of anxiety and fear of death in many people, and now fear of death through war, economical instability, fear of invasion, fear of nuclear strike and massive destruction. Well, so first, I would like to bring you some scientific evidence of what's really happening with this fear out there. And I want to highlight here 2 research articles, and one was actually published last year in the journal The Lancet, okay? It's a very reliable clinical scientific journal, by the way. And the title of this research is Global Prevalence and Burden of Depressive and Anxiety Disorders in 204 Countries and Territories in 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So what the authors did here was to conduct a systematic review of data reporting the prevalence of major depressive disorder and anxiety disorders during the COVID-19 pandemic that was published between January 2020, so the pre-pandemic period, and January 2021 in the middle of the pandemic. So they used a very well-established statistical model here to put together all this data in a meta-regression manner to estimate the changes in the prevalence of the major depressive disorder in the pandemic period, and also anxiety. The results are actually impressive, and they reveal an increase of roughly 53 million new cases of major depressive disorder and globally, which is an increase of roughly 27% of cases in the world. They also estimated an additional 76 million new cases of anxiety disorders globally, representing an increase of roughly 25% in the population. 25% increase in anxiety in the world. So this is a thing that we need to consider here in this discussion today. And I also want us to reference here a second article that I also will discuss more thoroughly later in the podcast, which was published in Science Advances, okay? So it's a very reliable journal, you can rely on it. It's the same publisher group of Science, which is the top scientific magazine in the world. And the title of this research is Media Exposure to Mass Violence Events Can Fuel a Cycle of Distress. So do you realize here, media exposure? And the researchers here in this article, they established a link between trauma-related media exposure and distress. And this relationship is actually cyclical. So, in other words, distress can increase a cyclical consumption of media that increases even more the distress to later events and results in more media consumption. In this article, the type of news was more related to bombing and war, which predicted post-traumatic disorders and stress symptoms in a large group of people evaluated in this study. And that perpetuates in a cycle of high distress and media usage over and over again. So using and consuming media with negative news related with mass destruction. So you might be asking yourself now, to what degree the way we react to the current negative circumstances in life, say developing symptoms to anxiety, distress, and depression, could really affect our mental and, more importantly, our physical health? Could this indeed have an impact on physiological systems, such as the immune system? Why depression is known today to reduce the effectiveness of the immune activity and is also associated with increased mortality. You might see yourself looking for answers this time, that there is a lot of uncertainty and fear in the world, and we often access news seeking voices of clarity, and what we find is even more uncertainty and fear. So today's podcast is very special because although I will delve into the scientific connection between the nervous system and the immune system, which is part of the recent scientific field called Neuroimmunology, and doing so, this podcast is directed towards answering your most common questions if there is indeed something pernicious about the fear of negative circumstances that we live today, mostly when it comes to economical crashes, COVID-19, and war. We can't change the circumstances that we live today, but we can surely have an enormous impact on how we react to those circumstances. And that's my promise to you. By the end of the next 60 minutes, you will have been exposed to a deep understanding of the relationship between our nervous system and our immunity, and some ideas that you will be able to incorporate into your repertoire, and they will ensure that you get the maximum opportunity to improve your life and to keep healthy. So let's initially define here two very important concepts, okay? Neuroplasticity and immunity. So first, neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is an unbelievable capacity of our neurons and neural network in the brain to change their connection and behavior in response to new information, sensory stimulation, development, damage, environmental influences, and conscious choices as well. So when you have a conscious choice process, it's rewiring the networks of the neurons in your brain. So it is proved by science today that you can actually consciously and programmatically rewire the neural network of your brain, and that can actually impact your health, right? And although there are a few neuroscientists out there that believe that this capacity to change itself in ways that we consciously decide is an exclusive feature of the nervous system and does not apply to other organs and systems in our body, this is not particularly true when it comes to the immune system. And the reason why is because there is a deep connection between the nervous system and the immune system, which orients the way its cellular subcomponents multiply, live, and fight infections. So it is a perfectly reasonable proposition that the nervous system is nothing but a beautiful tool that our immune system uses to respond in accordance with conscious thoughts or subconscious reactions to the circumstances in life. And the second term I want to define here is immunity. Immunity, by definition, is protection. Protection against disease, usually an infectious disease or cancer. Immunity is mediated by cells and tissues that are collectively called the immune system. So immunity is the ultimate goal of the immune system. And that said, immunity is a consequence, right? If you want to have immunity, you want to have, for example, B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes circulating in your bloodstream. You want to have antibodies produced by the B cell so it can neutralize the pathogens in your blood before it gets infected, before it infiltrates the tissues in your body, the organs. So you want your physiology and homeostasis to operate in the highest capacity so your immune cells live healthy and long enough to provide you immunity. And you want to have inflammation. So I just want to open some brackets here because some people have the proclivity to think that everything that is pro-inflammatory is a bad thing, and everything that is anti-inflammatory is a good thing. And it's actually not the case. The correct is the opposite. Inflammation is good. When you have an infection process somewhere, you want to have inflammation. You want that the endothelial cells, which are the cells that compose the blood vessels, okay? So we have blood vessels everywhere in our body, in our tissues, in our organs. And if there is an infectious process happening in that particular area of your tissues, you want that the blood vessels will, now the endothelial cells that compose them will dilate to enable the immune cells coming from the blood circulation to infiltrate the tissue to fight the infection. You want this to happen. And then the tissue will inflate. You have inflammation because there's a lot of cells going inside of this tissue. So it's like a balloon. It's an inflation process. If you don't have the inflammation, the virus will roughly just kill the normal cells that you have in your tissue, and will destroy cells after cells until it reaches the blood vessels, right? So by destroying the blood vessels, then you have bleeding in your tissue, and it's a catastrophic event because you destroyed or you corrupted the blood vessels there. You don't have any more nutrients in the tissue. So the other cells that are still healthy there, they start dying as well because they simply don't have nutrients coming from the blood. They don't have oxygen. This ultimately results in a death of the tissue, which is called ischemic necrosis. So the worst situation is when you let the virus of the bacteria to grow to the degree that it reaches the blood vessels because they are corrupted. Then they spread throughout your body. This is systemic spreading of the bacteria or the virus in a catastrophic event, which is a generalized infection or sepsis, and that leads to death. So it's very important to fight the infection in the beginning in an inflammatory process. You need to let inflammation run there. So how do you fight an infection? By taking anti-inflammatories? It's like, no. You fight an infection by letting the tissue run the inflammatory process. So, of course, you don't want that to happen, right? Because inflammation doesn't look good. It looks ugly. Sometimes if it is the skin, it's like swollen and black and it's like purple mesh in your skin, and it's painful, right? You might think that whatever is painful is not good for my body. So remember that everything in life that brings you progress or power, or that helps you to learn something or even to learn a new skill, every progress or every degree that you go over in the stairs in your life is a painful process. And even fighting an infection can be a painful thing. So fever, nobody wants fever. Fever is regarded to be a bad thing, but actually is a good thing. You want to have fever because fever is nothing but a manifestation of your immunity. It shows that your immune cells are properly working. So you want to have fever, and fever is very important. I remember the period that I was working my PhD when we had to inject, for example, immune adjuvant substance. They are substances that will support and activate the immune response in mice to cause fever, like short sequences of stimulating peptides, or even a component called LPS, which is a lipopolysaccharide. It's expressed in the surface of bacteria. It's highly like that when it binds to the receptors. They are mostly toll-like receptors in the surface of immune cells. It will activate a cascade event that stimulates the cells to secrete a lot of pro-inflammatory cytokines. And this is very important to fight cancer, for example, right? So some of these cytokines, they are called pyrogenic factors. They are literally chemicals that are released by immune cells when they are stimulated in their receptors in the surface of the cell, sort of like some sort of antennas that are expressed in the surface of the cell. So they start secreting in the bloodstream these pyrogenic factors like TNF or IL-1, IL-6. When I say IL, I'm talking about interleukin. It's a type of chemical. We don't need to go through it. You can watch one of my lectures about immune system and immune response. I have a full course of immunology in my YouTube channel. You can double check precisely about the interleukins. So they are secreted, they are chemicals, they are text messages. So they stimulate the endothelial cells there. Again, the cells that compose the walls of the blood vessels. And these cells will release in the tissues of the brains some factors that are also pyrogenic factors called prostaglandins. So What is a pyrogenic factor? The term means a substance or factor that produces heat. So in the brain, these prostaglandins will start stimulating the neurons of the hypothalamus, which is also a subcomponent of the brain, a small area in the center of our brain that activates the production of heat, primarily by activating the shivering reaction in the skeletal muscles or heat production in the brown adipose tissue, which is the BAT, so to speak, and that will affect also the heat dissipation by vasoconstriction in the periphery of our body. So all of this together contributes to rise in the temperature levels in our body. And why? Why this is so important? Why we need fever? Why we need to increase temperature? And it's simply because some chemical reactions in our body, they need a certain optimal temperature to happen, right? These are basic principles of physical chemistry, chemical reactions that need higher potential energy to start. They are called exothermic reactions. So, in fact, an elevated body temperature triggers cellular mechanisms that ensure that the immune system takes appropriate action against the attacking virus or the attacking bacteria, because it will put your metabolism in an optimal temperature to start specific chemical reactions that only work in a higher energy potential. And these reactions are so important, for example, to synthesize interleukins that are secreted in the body and even toxins produced by T lymphocytes or CD8 cells that secrete these toxins that are called granzyme B, perforin, granzyme H, and so forth. So we need to achieve a certain basal level of temperature to allow these chemical reactions to happen, right? So just so you know, relatively recent research from two prestigious academic institutions in the United Kingdom, the University of Warwick and also the University of Manchester, which, by the way, it's very close to the place where I executed my postdoc in Liverpool as a senior researcher. The researchers of this paper, Professor David Rand and Mike White, they led a team of mathematicians and biologists to understand what happens at the cellular level when fever takes hold. And these findings are absolutely amazing. They were published in this prestigious journal called Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, or PNAS. I often refer to this journal because it's a very reliable academic press. So this was published in 2018. You can confer by reading the article in PubMed. And what they found in this research is that small temperature increases, specifically at the early stages of the infection, they can dramatically change the dynamics of one core pathway in the immune response, which is called the NF-kappa beta, right? So the NF-kappa beta is a core gene expression program that ultimately results in the production of cytokines, and cytokines are fundamentally important to orient the pattern of immune response that will fight that particular infection in a short period of time. And for your information, this genetic program of the immune cells that guides the immune response is more effective against infection with viruses. So overall, these results suggest that temperature increases to regulate inflammatory response through a gene expression program that impacts several downstream functions of our inflammation. So it's very important to have inflammatory process, right? And this will ultimately wipe out the pathogen in the infected tissue. Isn't that amazing? So what is actually thought to be dangerous or bad in our body, say, if you have pain or inflammation or fever, so to speak, is actually a mechanism of defense that your metabolism is active and they are fighting a bug inside of you. Obviously, inflammation has a limit, and if you don't have enough immune cells at the beginning of the infection process, and there's a lot of virus out there or bacteria with their receptors, they superactivate the local immune cells there, which will ultimately cause superactivation of fever and the central nervous system, and the inflammation loses control, or the temperatures, they will rise so much and for so long that can be detrimental to the integrity of our proteins. And remember that we are all constituted by proteins. And one way of destroying proteins in our body is roughly to constantly expose to high temperatures and for long periods or days. So then in this setting, you want to reduce inflammation, you want to reduce fever. to an optimal and effective level. Then antipyrogenic drugs such as aspirin, for example, are useful because they block the formation of those prostaglandins that will activate the hypothalamus in the brains. So you won't stimulate the muscles or adipocytes or even induce vasoconstriction to the degree that the temperature will increase too much. Can you start seeing here now how our immune system may be connected to our nervous system in many, many ways? It actually depends on the central nervous system to impact the temperature and activation of molecular processes that increase immune reactions. So conscious thoughts and environmental influences that are regarded to lead to neuroplasticity, they can also ultimately lead to immune plasticity. In the last 70 years, an explosion of studies on cancer and AIDS, they led to groundbreaking discoveries in the fields of immunology. Now we are starting to recognize that there is something about plasticity or the flexibility and adaptability of our immune system. We can actually educate it. So turns out that this neuroconnection with the immune system, it goes back to where our immune cells are born. So it goes back to the bone marrow. Most people don't know that their immune cells are all derived from their bone marrow inside of their bones. And this is actually the nursery of the immune cells. And in this place, they are called hematopoietic stem cells. So initially, when these immune cells are born inside of the bone marrow, they are inexperienced, right? And for that reason, they are called naive cells. These cells still don't have a personality. They don't have an identity. They just sit there, waiting to be called in the case of an infection. And then they are delivered into the body through the bloodstream. And they go to the school to learn how to fight an infection. So the school is actually where they learn or mature. So the school is a lymphoid organ and the famous spleen or lymph nodes that you hear so many times. They convert themselves into these well-graduated specific subpopulations of immune defense cells. So in each second, specifically during the night period, we produce more than 1 million new white blood cells in this nursery of the immune system called bone marrow. So this process is called immune rejuvenation, right? And it is an incredible property of cell regeneration that any other system in our body has this property. So the life of a lymphocyte will last around roughly 1 to 3 months. And a lymphocyte is an immune cell that provides you with defense against bacteria and viruses. So the bone marrow needs to constantly supply new lymphocytes in our bloodstream because they are dying because their lifespan will end at some point. It's normal that they will die between 1 to 3 months. So we need to produce every day new lymphocytes to keep constantly a basal level of lymphocytes that provide with defense to our body. So if you want to have immunity, we need to take care of the nursery of baby immune cells, right? And how to do that? Well, first you need to know how it works. And here's the thing. The control of the expansion and differentiation of new immune cells, so to speak, immune rejuvenation, is in the bone marrow is tightly regulated by the central and the peripheral nervous systems. But how does it happen? In order to understand this process, we need to go back to some definitions about the nervous system. To study the nervous system, we usually divide it in two ways, in terms of its anatomy and in terms of its function. Regarding the anatomy, we divide the nervous system into central, which is composed by the organs of the brain and the spinal cord, and peripheral, composed by the nerves that depart from the central nervous system to the periphery of our body. So now regarding the functional aspect, we divide the nervous system in two ways, the somatic and the autonomic. So the somatic nervous system, which is also called the voluntary nervous system, is the one responsible for the conscious control of the body movements via the skeletal muscles, right? And the autonomic nervous system is part of the peripheral nervous system that controls visceral functions such as digestion, as well as the heart rate, respiratory rate, circadian rhythm, and the immune system. It consists of three parts, the enthetic, parasympathetic, and the sympathetic nervous system. And I will focus here only the sympathetic nervous system. However, some other pathways of the autonomic nervous system, they are used controlled by other structures in the brain. For example, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is also our biological clock. So I want to focus here a little bit in the suprachiasmatic nucleus. I will call this SCN to make it easier. So the SCN is part of the hypothalamus, this small structure that we have in the center of our brains. The SCN is the peacemaker in the brain. And doing so, it generates circadian rhythms. And circadian derives from the Latin roots circadian, right? Which means around a day. So it is important for you to know that this area of the hypothalamus regulates melatonin secretion in the night by this pineal gland in response to the environmental dark and light cycle in the day. So it is equally important to remember as well that from the hypothalamus, there are projections that achieve the sympathetic and parasympathetic preautonomic neurons. So, meaning that this area of the brain impacts many aspects of our behavior and physiology by circadian rhythms through anatomic structures of the neurons there. So, including sleep, alertness, hormone levels, body temperatures, and immune functions, these are all routines structured by circadian rhythms controlled by the hypothalamus in response to this gland or this part of the hypothalamus, the SCN that we have there. So how our nervous system connects with the bone marrow to create new immune cells. So you have immunity every day. To illustrate this, I will refer to a major publication in the field that described this process actually. This is a publication from Nature, okay? So this was published in Nature in 2008 by Simon Mansferrer and his colleagues. And the title of this research is Hematopoietic Stem Cell Release is Regulated by Circadian Oscillations. So this research shows that within the bone marrow, we have connections with the peripheral sympathetic neurons. So when I say sympathetic, they are part of the autonomous nervous system, okay? But the circadian rhythm uses these terminals to control the secretion of one hormone that is called norepinephrine. So turns out that some stromal cells inside of the bone marrow, and when I say stromal cells, I mean that the cells that are physically constituting the bone marrow inside of the bone marrow, they are the factory of immune cells there. So they express receptors in their surface to these hormones that are unleashed by the neural connections through the sympathetic nervous system inside of the bone. So these receptors, they are called adrenoceptors or AR. So when these adrenoceptors in the bone marrow, they are stimulated by norepinephrine coming from the sympathetic fibers, they start secreting a chemical which is called CXCL12. Okay, it's a cytokine. It's a hormone of the immune system. So the stromal cells now stimulated by norepinephrine, they understand the signal from the sympathetic fibers of the nervous system, and they said, okay, let's convert this now to a message that the immune cells will understand. Because the immune cells, they also can understand norepinephrine, but I will unleash something here that will activate them. So I will unleash here this chemoattractant, which is called CXCL12. Turns out that when CXCL12 is released inside of the microenvironment of the bone marrow, it will unleash the progenitors of the immune cells that were proliferating during the night in the bone, and they will unleash from the bone, they will drop in the bloodstream, and they will be distributed in the body. So the signal for that to happen is the CXCL12, right? And this was only released thanks to the stromal cells in the bone marrow that were stimulated by norepinephrine, right? So the authors in the study conclude that this process doesn't happen randomly, right? But rather follows a time-dependent process which peaks 5 hours after the first light exposure in the day. So when you wake up and you open your eyes and you're exposed to light, it starts stimulating this SCN, the light pulse. It stimulates the SCN that tells the hypothalamus to activate the sympathetic fibers to secrete norepinephrine. ultimately stimulates the stromal cells in the bone marrow to start now opening the portals of the bone to unleash the immune cells that were produced during the night. So after the first light exposure in the day, and after 5 hours of the first light exposure, it peaks the amounts of immune cells, new immune cells circulating in your body. So roughly around 11 a.m. is the moment where you have the highest efficacy of this process in your body. And it starts decreasing as well when the dark period starts, roughly when in the night, so around 6 or 7 p.m. And after 5 hours, the start of the dark period, you have the lowest activation of the SCN, or the stimulation of norepinephrine production. And you start now activating another process, which is the stimulation and production of melatonin, which will in turn activate the pineal gland to induce the proliferation of new immune cells during the night. And this is regulated by light and dark cycle. So you need to respect this. And you need to understand that this is happening so you contribute with this process, right? Vaccinations in the morning induce an enhanced antibody response compared with vaccinations in the afternoon. And the reason why is because you have the highest amount of immune cells being distributed over your tissues and in the bloodstream. And remember, there are 2 stages of vaccination. The first time you take the vaccine, you are introducing the antigen to your body. So there is one type of immune cell that you want there to be effective, which is the monocyte, right? Monocytes, they will be converted in dendritic cells, and also they will be converted in macrophages. Mostly dendritic cells are efficient in this process. So they uptake the components of the vaccine to bring them to the lymphocytes that are hosted in the lymphoid organs, so in the skull, and they will start training these lymphoid cells, the lymphocytes, the B cells, B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes with these antigens. And this will ultimately result in memory lymphocytes that start circulating in your body, right? So when you unleash new immune cells in your circulation, you don't only produce or unleash new B lymphocytes or new T lymphocytes, you also need the monocytes that will take the fragments of this vaccine to train the lymphocytes. They all come from the bone marrow. So you need to have high levels of these monocytes circulating in your body. So I'm just highlighting this here. This is fundamentally important to preserve the light and dark cycle so you reconstitute enough immune cells to make the vaccines work. So it's not only taking the vaccine and that's it, you have the protection. Why many people receive the vaccine and they get infected in the next week or after a month or 2? Oh, because the vaccines are not effective. That's not the case. It's not because the vaccine were not well produced. It's because there is a process here to be respected, so the vaccine will have an effect. Vaccine will cause the establishment of new memory cells in your body, but if you don't produce every day enough immune cells to activate these memory cells that are already there, so you have 50% of the process already done, but if you don't produce new monocytes to activate them because you didn't sleep well, because you interrupted the light and dark cycle that's happening in your bone marrow, of course you will develop the disease. Of course you get infected. So here comes the first application of today's podcast, which will not orient you to take any medicine or to purchase any medical device. No, it's purely dependent on the decision-making process. It is very clear now from works, some of them, they were made in Finland and elsewhere in the world as well. It is clear that if you want to boost your immunity, you need to respect the 24 hours light and dark cycles. Right? If you really try to make everything that is possible to go to sleep at the time when your bone marrow is empty and needs to be closed now to produce new immune cells, and they're ready to produce them. So roughly around 10 or 11 p.m. that starts this process in the night. The more you can sleep from this point onwards, you give to your bone marrow the potential to inflate with a lot of new progenitor immune cells that can be unleashed in the morning. And it starts around 11 p.m., right? When your melatonin levels produced by the pineal gland are high, and they will pulse the sympathetic fibers of the nervous system to constantly stimulate the bone marrow to generate new immune cells in this process. It's not only given the time in the night so your factory works properly to produce new immune cells, you need already to have the nutrients for that. And when I'm talking about the nutrients, I'm talking about the raw material that will create new immune cells. Remember when I said our bone marrow produces roughly 1 million cells per second in a process that's more effective in the night. So you need like 1 million per second of cell membranes, and cell membranes are made of fat. And you need like all the proteins that constitute this cell. We talk about the receptors that will be activated to start an immune response, or even the poison that the immune cells will secrete to kill the pathogen. They are all proteins. And these proteins are made of amino acids. So imagine in your diet, if you're not eating proteins, how can you produce the proteins that the immune cells will need to use? And they are constituting these proteins during the night when the factory is working. And you also need energy. If you're avoiding carbs, or if you're like in a severe deprivation of carbs, so you need to have energy to make this factory work, so these immune cells will amplify in numbers per second. And if you even sleep well, but you don't have these nutrients or this raw material, how can you produce new immune cells? So be diligent in your diet as well. Make sure you have proper amount of vitamins as well. All the vitamins, there are engines that will work in some particular biochemical process inside of the cell to produce the proteins of the immune response, the cytokines, the chemokines, the interleukins, the receptors of the lymphocytes, of the monocytes, and so forth. So you need vitamins to orient these engines to work properly. Because even if you have all the amino acids, all the fat, all the water and the salt, everything, the nucleosides that will create new DNA, because these cells also are amplifying numbers, so you need new DNA, you need new nucleotides there, it's a different type of chemical, but then you don't have the engines to put this whole thing to work. So you just have for dinner, in a day, you just ate pizza, and then some snacks or chips in the afternoon. So literally eating only fat and some carbs, but then it's lacking proper amount of amino acids. You don't have the vitamins, you don't have any source of DNA material that's mostly coming from vegetables. And to make proteins, you need engines. And these engines or enzymes, they only work in the presence of specific metals that need to be present in your diet, or vitamins. So this is one of the functions of the vitamins. They attach to the enzymes that will create the proteins that your immune system needs to fight a particular infection. So if you don't have enough vitamins, particularly in the perspective of the immune response, of course you use vitamins also for other processes in your body. So that's why you need to have enough. So make sure that you're not only passing one day with a diet like I'm just eating a pizza today. It doesn't include all the nutrients and the needed nutrients to constitute new immune cells. And one immune cell includes a lot of different nutrients. And then after 1 week, you get infected. Oh, but I took the vaccine, or I'm protecting and using masks, wearing masks, but you don't have immunity, right? You don't have enough immune cells to put the vaccine to work or to get the benefit of the vaccination. If you forget these basic principles, you will more often get infected. But if you follow this diligently, if you make sure that you're sleeping properly, giving this 8 hours respect to the cycle of daily light circadian rhythm that communicates the sympathetic nervous system to the bone marrow, and you proliferate these immune cells, taking the material from your diet, including all the subcomponents of your diet. Try to get rid of everything that could potentially wake you up in the night, and respect the light and dark cycle. Try to sleep a bit earlier. Don't go to sleep too late, and give time to your bone marrow to properly produce new immune cells. And when it's around 7 a.m. in the morning, make sure to gradually get a good amount of light exposure in your eyes to start the process of releasing new immune cells in the blood. That reaches the highest efficacy around 5 hours after the beginning of this process. So here you understand that respecting the sleep time and understanding the need for light and dark exposure is critical to have the highest possible amounts of immune cells circulating in your body. And this process is more efficient in the mornings, right? Did you know that human studies show that vaccination in the morning induces an enhanced antibody response compared with vaccination in the afternoon or even in the evenings? Immune response during the homeostatic states are also regulated by circadian signals. And also when you think about memory in your brain, one of the major processes coordinated during sleep is the consolidation and stabilization of memories. And this is well known and extensively studied and published in most reliable journals with high citation frequency, by the way. It is known today that immune memory response is also enhanced by sleep, and that sleep promotes the spatial distribution of immune cells throughout the body. And for that reason, vaccination efficacy is enhanced and optimal in the mornings to enhance the memory status of your immunity. Enhance your immunity by acquiring good sleep and awakening habits. And that said, you will be more invulnerable to common daily infections, you will respond better to vaccines, and you will have increased amounts of circulating memory cells to protect you from eventual pathogens exposure. So what I want to say here is that I'm emphasizing this podcast in the sympathetic nervous system that coordinates the immune response in a circadian cycle manner. So what I want to highlight here is that I'm discussing and focusing here in the sympathetic nervous system that impacts our immunity, right? And this is mostly coordinated in a circadian rhythm fashion. So it is important for you to know that long-term variations in the basal levels of the circadian rhythm that affects the sympathetic nervous system, it also will impact other tissues and organs in our body that will replace or activate new gene expression programs in these organs. And this is actually a natural process that is controlled by a molecular mobility and defense program, which is called MMDP, right? That means that sometimes we need to change the dynamics of the sympathetic nervous system to adapt a broad range of cellular functions to detect and respond more effectively to challenging, threatening, or novel environments. For instance, mobilizing the energy and promoting mobility, strength, perceptual acuity, and antimicrobial defenses, and wound healing, for example. However, massive research in the past decade revealed that if you actually change the circadian dynamics of the sympathetic nervous system activation towards a long-term activation process, it can be bad, and it can actually induce disease or induce the progression of cancer, for example. So I will reveal to you now what are the physiological consequences of constant activation, I'm saying chronic activation of the sympathetic nervous system to our immunity, and how this has a negative impact on our immunity. And you need to remember here that our organs and tissues communicate in various ways using chemicals that are called hormones or cytokines or interleukins. So these are all text messages that find their target cells in the body, and they have an influence on their behavior. And the most important hormone of the sympathetic nervous system here is norepinephrine. And another hormone that is important but is not particularly from the sympathetic nervous system is the epinephrine. And epinephrine is a hormone from the adrenal gland on the top of your kidney. So it circulates via the blood vessels, and it targets different tissues as well. So norepinephrine and epinephrine, they are called adrenergic molecules because they regulate target cells and tissues via 5 different types of receptors. And these receptors are actually called adrenergic receptors, and they are differently expressed in different parts of our body. And we have the adrenergic receptors alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3. And I will not discuss about all of them, but I will bring focus here to beta 2 adrenergic receptors that is predominantly expressed in our immune cells and also in cancer cells. So the sympathetic nervous system, they secrete the norepinephrine and epinephrine that they can target the beta 2 adrenergic receptors that are expressed in the immune cells. So our immune cells are vulnerable to the command of the sympathetic fibers. And it's very important for you to know that the sympathetic nervous system is very sensitive. Unlike other stress-activated neuroendocrine systems, such as the hypothalamus-pituitary-adrenal axis, the sympathetic nervous system is easily activated by the mere anticipation of threat. For example, first-time parachute jumpers have the highest plasma levels of epinephrine and norepinephrine just before they actually jump from the airplane. So that happens in response to anticipation of the jump rather than the jump itself. So the sympathetic nervous system is so sensitive that its stimulation and responses can often occur at thresholds before those that are consciously experienced, which is triggered by fear, stress, and also injury. So the sympathetic nervous system responses to stress do not decay over time following repeated threat exposure, but it rather remains active and upregulates norepinephrine levels more strongly than the normal levels of epinephrine, especially in cases of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is commonly observed in people who are chronically exposed to adverse social environments, such as, for example, poverty and social isolation, war, and even very demanding, uncontrollable jobs. So, although the sympathetic nervous system mediated anticipatory reaction might be an evolutionary adaptation to threatening situations, it has also enabled the very different conditions of modern life to chronically stimulate biological stress response that unfortunately facilitates the development and progression of infection and chronic diseases as cancer. So this is what we are going to discuss now. So several clinical observations spurred by pharmacoepidemiologic data showed that reduced cancer progression happened in patients who were incidentally exposed to beta-adrenergic antagonists, and this happened before the diagnosis. So experimental studies using very well-established in vivo models in preclinical research have now shown that behavioral stress can indeed accelerate the progression of breast cancer, prostate cancer, ovarian carcinomas, neuroblastoma, malignant melanomas, pancreatic carcinoma, and also some hematopoietic cancers such as leukemia. And the experimental models that the scientists are using now, they are actually clinical, they are compatible with the clinical observations, and scientists could actually reverse the impact of stressors on cancer progression by using these beta-adrenergic inhibitors. So scientists know today that when the sympathetic nervous system is overstimulated by stress response, it will also impact DNA repair process and will activate as well oncogenes. Oncogenes are the genes that we normally express, we actually have in our genome, but they are sleeping. And when they are expressed by environmental changes that impact the dormance of these genes, they will wake up and they will start being expressed and they can induce cancer, right? So oncogenes are the areas of the genome, of our genome, that are sleeping, and we don't want them to wake up, right? So the sympathetic nervous system, when it's constantly activated, it can wake up these oncogenes, and when they start being expressed, they induce cancer. So this is what usually happens. And beta-adrenergic overstimulation can also inhibit the DNA damage repair process, which is actually a fundamentally process to protect us from emerging tumors. For example, in our normal cells, when they are duplicating or proliferating, sometimes there are some random errors in the replication process of the DNA. And if you know, if you are replicating your cells, you also want to replicate the DNA because all the cells have nucleus, right? So errors in the DNA replication can result in mutations. You don't want to have mutations in your DNA during the replication process. So even some oxidative process that might eventually cause some sort of DNA damage can result in mutations. So all of this together could lead to cancer. And if it happens in areas of the genome that control the duplication of our cells, it will induce actually the carcinogenic process. In our genome, we have areas, specific areas in our DNA that they regulate the proliferation of the cells, and they are called cell cycle regulators, right? And we don't want to have mutations in these areas because otherwise we will lose control of the duplication process. So these cells will start duplicating without any sort of control. So that's the carcinogenic process. And the activation, constant activation of sympathetic nervous system through beta-adrenergic receptors may also block the repair of damaged DNA, which ultimately results in mutation, an accumulated mutational level. Several molecular pathways have now been implicated in the inhibition of DNA damage repair system through the constant activation of the sympathetic nervous system, which ultimately affects a core signaling control in our cells, which is called AKT. The AKT pathway, it entails a network connection with several other signaling pathways that induce survival and proliferation of our cells. So if by some sort of mutations you have the constant activation of AKT pathway, these cells now proliferate without any sort of control, and they resist this proliferation. It activates survival programs of these cells. Then you have the tumor formation. Another example is the catecholamine activation of these beta-adrenergic receptors will activate as well another transcription factor. It's not the AKT now, but it's also the STAT3, which subsequently activates RBB2 and Src kinases. So these are all important proteins inside of the cell that will induce not only the proliferation without any sort of control, but also induce metastatic process of these tumor cells. So they become metastatic, and especially STAT3 activation can also happen in the microenvironment of the tumor and suppress the immune response there. So it's a mess, right? So this aberrant signaling through the sympathetic nervous system can profoundly impact the immune system, since it also suppresses other important cytokines that drive the immune response to fight these tumors. So for example, the Th1 type of immune response is roughly coordinated by interferons. Interferon gamma type 1, and interferon type 2. So this type of cytokines are produced by T helper cells type 1, and they are secreted inside of the microenvironment of the tumors, right? And the sympathetic nervous system activation are regarded to neutralize the production of these interferons. So then you lose the signaling capacity of the immune cells to coordinate a proper cellular immune response against cancer. So you don't want that to happen. But this is happening. This was discovered. And enhanced beta-adrenergic signaling also suppresses the cytotoxic functions of T lymphocytes and another type of immune cell, which is called natural killer cells. So these lymphocytes and natural killer cells, they also have receptors, these adrenoceptors in their surface, and when they are activated, they become suppressed. So T lymphocytes cannot secrete their poisons to kill the tumor cells, nor can also the natural killer cells, because they have similar process of cytotoxicity against the cancer cells, right? So the vast majority of the literature indicates that the overstimulation of sympathetic nerve fibers generally contributes with the tumor progression through a pleiotropic array of molecular alterations in the primary tumor microenvironment, but also contributes with metastasis. But let's talk now about when events or environmental demands exceed one's ability to cope, issuing psychological stress response that are manifested in negative thoughts and emotions, ultimately impacting our immunity. So there is a lot of science in this field, and researchers often use animal and human models to learn how the immune system communicates bidirectionally with the central nervous system and the endocrine system, and how these interactions actually impact our health. So almost roughly 3 decades of studies have provided evidence that immune changes, mostly issued by stressful events, can provoke health changes. And these stressful events range from common daily hassles to chronic calamities, such as the ones that we're living today, with the pandemics, or more recently with the war in the Ukraine. So let's define here what is a stressor. And one simple definition of stressor is that a stressor is a stimulus that activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis that we have in our brain, and also the sympathetic nervous system, right? Which ultimately influences the organism's response in attempt to adapt physiologically to deal with a particular threat. So in general terms, physiological stress happens when events or environmental demands exceeds one's ability to cope. And there are 2 possible consequences to our immunity when it comes to our response to a physiological stressor. For example, chronic stressors, such as suffering a traumatic injury that leads to physical disability, they are deleterious to some immunological functions. But very brief stressors, for example, the ones lasting less than 2 hours, they can actually enhance some aspects of our immunity, such as the trafficking of cells from lymphoid organs to the peripheral blood, or even to the skin. So actually, medical sciences and preclinical research using mice suggest that the only situation where stress might be a good thing for our immunity is when subjects are exposed to very brief stressors. So for example, short-term stressors like public speaking briefly increase natural killer cell activities. So several studies are showing that, and also increase the numbers of some other types of leukocytes circulating in our blood. And just so you know, the natural killer cell is a type of immune cells that is naturally resident in our tissues. They're already there. They're waiting for some sort of infection with the virus to fight the virus and also to fight some carcinogenic processes. So we have these cells there, and they are naturally activated in some brief stress events that last less than 2 hours. And another example is the positive impact of ice swimming in the activation of the sympathetic nerve fibers, to release norepinephrine in the bone marrow, to help the immune rejuvenation process. But this is this is a short-term stressor. So this process is a short-term stressor. You're not constantly activating the sympathetic nervous system, but this is a short-term activation that lasts less than 2 hours. This is beneficial. Now, regarding long-lasting stressors, a lot of research in the fields of neuroimmunology has suggested that they can increase susceptibility to infectious agents and also diminish the strength of our immune response to vaccines. So these long-lasting stressful events evokes distress response that substantially increase the production of immunosuppressive cytokines. Cytokines are chemicals, so immunosuppressive chemicals that suppress the local and peripheral immune responses. So they are actually now being correlated with a significant spectrum of age-related disease as well. We'll comment a little bit about this. So essentially, these long-lasting stressor events, they can evoke immune dysregulation by the release of the pituitary and adrenal hormones in our bloodstream. And which hormones are those? For example, the catecholamines, mostly known as adrenaline and noradrenaline, or the adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, or cortisol, growth hormone, and prolactin. So all these are hormones together or separately. The levels of these hormones, they are all influenced by negative emotions, which will further disturb the quality and quantity of our immune responses, right? So do you want to know an example of a mental disorder that can substantially increase the amounts of one of these hormones, for instance, cortisol levels, which can provoke multiple adverse immunological changes? This mental disorder is called depression. And as you probably know, depression or major depressive disorder is a very common illness that negatively impacts or affects how you feel, the way you think, and how you react, and thus impairs also the brain's neuroplasticity, or your capacity to rewire your brains and control your emotions through conscious thoughts and decisions. So depressed people often experience symptoms of sadness, grief, despair, and misery. In addition, they often also lose the appetite, the sexual desire, and have severe insomnia. Often associated with these symptoms is also a state of psychomotor turbulence. But how scientists could find that immunological changes are related to mental health disorders? Initially, it's about a questionnaire that is performed with the patient. So the scientists have perfected several methods that measure the person's immune response status, and they correlate this with life events through the lens of well-validated questions and statistical tests. It is through questions such as, how frequently in the past week did you feel you could not control important things in your life? Or how often did I feel that things were piling up so high that I could not overcome them? So answers to such questions can help you to find correlative causes to the conditions of your immunity in that particular window of time. And they are often obstacles to the neuroplasticity. Physiological and immunological response can be studied in people who are experiencing distress-generating events. For example, a student taking an exam, or a spouse going through a divorce, or even more chronic stressors such as caring for a husband or a wife who has cancer, for example. These are all long-term stressors, and let us not forget also the stressor called burnout, which is defined by the pure manifestation of job strain or unemployment, isolation, and even exposure to hostile climates. And let's not forget here the long-term stressors that are caused by post-traumatic disorders. So literally, people who are facing post-traumatic disorders or symptoms of post-traumatic disorders, they can be also vulnerable to immune dysfunction. So they usually get post-traumatic stress disorder because, for example, a relationship collapsed on them suddenly. And that is quite common actually. So they might get betrayed or someone leaves them suddenly and they don't know what to do anymore, especially if they are high in this personality trait conscientiousness, because they tear themselves apart trying to figure out what they did wrong to bring that about that event. And the reason they are doing that is that they want to retool their perceptions and their actions so that the probability that they will have the same experience again is minimized. And their mind will not leave them alone until they do it. So if the problem is the collapse of a relationship, and you've been with this person for many, many years in your life, so you probably did so many things with them, and that the idea that you did something wrong pretty much extends to every single thing you ever did with this person. So this cannot be fixed, and it causes a deep trauma. So what happens in the brain in such situations? That is an example of a pragmatic element of thought, right? So within the brain itself, apart from the major subdivisions, there are minor subcomponents that play a role in this process, like the caudate nucleus, for example. It's inside of the cerebral cortex, which, by the way, is a huge part of the brain that's about a square meter if you unfold it. It's amazing. And the caudate nucleus actually works not only in the planning, the execution of movements, but it also in the learning process, in memory, reward, motivation, emotion, and romantic interactions. Then you have the thalamus, and the thalamus, which is the place where a lot of the information in the brain appears to be integrated. Then you have the hippocampus, and one of the things the hippocampus does is to compare your model of the world as it unfolds with the model that you desire to be okay. And it keeps track on mismatches. So if it detects a mismatch, then it disinhibits emotional and motivational centers in your brain, and that is the beginning of your response to the unknown, to the uncertainty, to fear, such as events that our generation was recently exposed to, like the pandemics and all the inadequacies of this war in the Ukraine. So the ability to unwind after stressful events in life or after being constantly exposed to threats or negative news, or so to speak, is relatively difficult, especially for those people whose personality traits tangle to be with high neuroticism, right? So this is a personality trait which contributes to absorbing a huge amount of negative emotions from the environmental stressors that we are exposed to. And doing so, it influences the total burden that stressors place on an individual. So stressors that are perceived as unpredictable or not controllable continue to be associated with increased levels of stress hormones. So look into the science of the neurological consequence of the long-term exposure to stressors like this. It is known today that experiencing a stressful situation as perceived by the brain results in the stimulation of the sympathetic adrenomedullary system. But leukocytes, which are roughly your total immune cells, they have receptors for stress hormones that are produced by the adrenal glands on the top of your kidneys. And they can be modulated by binding to these hormones in their receptors. So in addition, noradrenaline produced at the nerve endings can also modulate immune cell functions by binding to its receptors expressed in the surface of these immune cells. And they are actually located in the lymphoid organ. So it also modulates the entire lymphoid organ. So these interactions are bidirectional, right? And meaning that once these leukocytes are excited, they will become in a way that they will start secreting their own hormones. In this case, the hormones of the immune system, they are the cytokines. And the cytokines will also drop in the bloodstream, go to the brains, and stimulate the hypothalamus. So it is well known that long-term stressors can enhance the risk of developing infectious disease and even if infectious episodes. These findings, they were actually reproduced in a lab scale in preclinical research using mouse models. So The scientists have perfected a model here. They restrain the movement of mice to provoke mid to long-term stress in these mice. The mice are placed in some sort of tubes, and in the end, they can only move forwards or backwards, but they cannot turn around. So one example of data obtained using this mouse model showed that these mice changed the immune response profile to influenza virus infection, including the kinetics of antibody production and also the production of pro-inflammatory cytokines. And remember, you want to have inflammation, right? If you want to fight this infection, you need to produce pro-inflammatory cytokines. So they observed that mice that were stressed in this situation, they have lower levels of antibodies and also pro-inflammatory cytokines. And immune cell trafficking to lungs infected with the influenza virus was also significantly reduced in the stressed mice, as was the size of the draining lymph nodes, by the way. And remember that the lymph nodes are the place where the immune cells are trained to fight infections. So because there were less immune cells there, the school of these immune cells was literally empty. So when the scientists actually treated these mice afterwards with antidepressant drugs, their ability to produce new immune cells reconstitute the numbers of the levels of antibodies and pro-inflammatory cytokines was restored. Beautiful. But these are all preclinical studies, right? And when I say preclinical, I mean studies that were performed in animals. But what can we say about human studies? Well, consistent with these mouse studies, research on influenza vaccine with human participants showed that stress can negatively impact the risk for developing infection amongst vaccinated participants. For example, men and women who were chronically stressed by caring for a spouse with dementia, for example, they showed clear deficits in both their cellular and humoral immune response to an influenza virus vaccine. And these are well-known studies that were published in PNAS and also reproduced in The Lancet. So very reliable clinical research journals. I can share these articles with you. And it's known that the antiviral capacity of vaccines depends on their ability to induce both humoral and cell-mediated immune responses as well. And this two-arm mechanism was also significantly reduced in long-term stressed individuals in these studies. So the same is also true for the situation we recently lived with the COVID pandemics, because this is not about the type of virus, right? But solely about the quality and quantity of our immune responses. So this will actually be affected and by the levels of stress that we are facing, like anxiety, burnout, depression, insomnia, and our mental and physical health. So in several other studies, of which some of them published in the New England Journal of Medicine, also a very reliable journal that I can share this article with you, they described that this stress can indeed impact one's susceptibility to infection with respiratory virus. So I'm not even specifying one species here, but I'm talking about in general, respiratory virus family, right? How about other types of virus? For example, HIV. So HIV and herpes. Several researchers observed that social stress actually impacts HIV-associated disease, which is AIDS, right? And this was shown in preclinical but also in clinical studies. For example, HIV-infected men experiencing more stressful life events and less social or interpersonal support, they have a 2 or 3-fold higher probability to develop AIDS. So, as you can see here, chronic stress associated with any long-lasting negative emotion or circumstances in life that affect our sympathetic nervous system ability to regulate its signals, it may indeed disturb the healthy way that we respond to diseases. But it's also important for you to know that evidence shows that the side effects of long-lasting stressors are not only over the ways we respond to diseases, but it can also induce premature aging to our immune system. Yeah. So you probably heard about the telomere. And the telomere is one segment at the end of the chromosome, or a fragment of DNA, so to speak, that contains the information of how many replication cycles this cell here will have. So each time that the cell divides, the telomeres, they become shorter. So when there is one duplication stage here, the telomere will become shorter. and shorter and shorter, following several duplication processes to the degree that it's so short, the telomere is so short that it cannot be cut anymore. And then this cell here can't duplicate anymore. So the next time that eventually this cell would duplicate, it would actually die, right? So imagine here when our fibroblasts in the skin of our face, they already duplicated all its permissive numbers during a lifetime. And remember that the fibroblasts that we have in our skin, they are the ones that secrete or that produce collagen. So when you lose these cells, when they already reach all the duplication cycles, they cannot duplicate anymore, the telomeres are so short they will die at some point in our life, then we stop producing collagen, and that's why the tissue starts looking older, right? But we have an enzyme called telomerase, and this enzyme is responsible for the maintenance of the length of the telomere. It tries to work so that, okay, let's expand a little bit more this telomere here. So this cell will survive for longer. So if you want to improve your lifespan, you need to improve the activity of telomerase in your cells, so it will reestablish the size of the telomere so these cells can still keep proliferating for longer, and then you will not have the death of these cells in your tissues. So studies have shown that mothers that are simply caring for a chronically ill child in comparison with those carrying healthy children, they have lower levels of telomerase activity in their cells, in their immune cells. And as a consequence of that, they have reduced length of the telomeres inside of the white blood cells. So meaning that these cells are dying faster. So they have reduced levels of immune cells in their circulation, simply because there is a long-lasting stressor in their lives that is activating or is actually decreasing the lifespan of the immune system, right? So finally, I would like to share some perspectives on how to fight stressors related to mental disorders that impact our immunity. These are actually some of my typical routines and methods that help to promote a pristine engagement between good mental health and immunity. So coping with a crisis like COVID or war is not easy and demands willpower and diligence, but it's really possible to be strategic about that. So coping mechanisms out there can vary from self-distraction, active coping, denial, substance use even, or use of emotional support, use of instrument support, behavioral disengagement, venting, positive reframing, planning strategies, and humor, acceptance, religion, and others. But what you need to know actually is that some of these coping mechanisms will really be beneficial to you, and others cannot make any impact or even be unhealthy. In the case, for example, of substance use like alcohol. So I don't recommend that. But what I want to share here today is the science of some specific coping strategies that are highly likely to help you to cope with anxiety and distress, to ultimately have a positive feedback in your health, to protect your immunity and help you to fight infections and cancer. Usually, general coping mechanisms are divided in two major groups. The mechanisms that promote engagement, so to speak, they are passive coping styles, right? So mostly problem solving, cognitive reconstruction, express emotion, social support, and etc. And we also have the mechanisms that promote disengagement. They are more passive coping styles, not active. So roughly problem avoidance, wishful thinking, self-criticism, and social withdrawal. So what I want to point out here is what science speaks about three of these coping mechanisms: the cognitive restructuring, problem avoidance, and wishful thinking. Regarding the cognitive restructuring, what is that? If you are thinking of something like the worst thing that ever happened or existed, cognitive restructuring will actually help you to face this problem as it would be the most exciting challenge that ever existed for you. Or at least to some degree, it will reveal you some of the good parts of this problem. So it is an active approach that will help you to not focus on the negativity of the issue, but also to unlock the positive aspects of the situation. If you think about COVID-19, it is a matter of choice to completely focus on that negative thing or to give more attention to the opportunities that this new challenge brings, like remote work. Some people that can do remote work, I'm just an example, okay? Some people can do remote work, or even those that cannot do remote work, but they know that other people are doing so. It actually helps to reduce many other burdens in the society, in the common life today, such as the traffic in the rush hour, or reduce the smog, because it reduces now how much we drive the cars or we are flying, and so forth. Or even forcing business to look into the potential to let employees working from home. So also some families that couldn't even stay together in this context of their busy lives, and now having some hopes to get together again. People may often think that they desire to engage to a new hobby or to start doing a new activity, but they never do that. But you have the energy now, so why not try to do that? So maybe that would be a good circumstance for life out of this problem. So this is cognitive restructuring or cognitive reconstruction. What would you prefer to do in face of the problem? Just to continuously stay angry? What would be the cost for that? My energy? Am I losing my energy so that this would impact my emotions and reduce my ability to sleep, being ultimately toxic to my immunity? Am I allowing this problem to help me becoming a bitter person, or let this negativity to impact my relationships? No way, I don't want that, right? So in the same way that we can think or react to a circumstance in a life that can benefit your health and immunity, you can also benefit your community, because we have this power to impact people surrounding us with our emotions. So being negative or being positive impacts people. So if we lack the ability to properly find the positive effects or the positive aspects in one particular matter, for example, in the context of war, it's not easy to find a positive aspect in war unless you are in your enemy's mind and then you find the proper reasons for war. But of course, this is not the case. So another way to use a cognitive restructuring in this situation here is to pose a challenge to the matter. For instance, it is really going to be as catastrophic as portrayed. Okay, I cannot impact, I think that this is wrong, but is it really going to be the end of the world? What are the chances for that? Or is there any possibility that overthinking of this problem is making me seeing it as the most terrible circumstance that it actually is? So the simple act of posing those questions already starts breaking a negative looping of anxiety-provoking thoughts. You can also ask yourself, how likely I will really die if I get COVID? Many people went through the experience of fear of death because they plunged so badly in the fear of death by simply being exposed to someone with COVID. They were thinking they were going to die. Then after a while, these people got even infected with COVID. And no matter how severe or symptomatic was the experience, death didn't happen. So why not considering before that there would be a possible good outcome or worst scenario is not actually going to happen? So in the case of war, even if we can't have a reason for seeing a positive outcome of that, it is really the case that we are facing the end of the world? We already went through that once or twice, right? I'm not even talking about the world wars, but also in the Cold War with the fear of nuclear strike. And it wasn't the case, right? So there is indeed still the possibility for a good outcome, or that nothing worse will happen. As an immunologist during the pandemic, I want to give you this example. I could easily identify some of the false facts or news that were unleashed in the media about COVID or about our immune system. That helped me actually to orient myself and pose those questions. Is it really the case? No. This is not in accordance to what I studied before. And this line of thought actually helped me to preserve my mental health, and also helped me to impact my society, or at least my close community, to not get too worried or too stressed about these events. So that actually proved to me the efficacy of this method of cognitive restructuring, right? And if you want to know more about the scientific proofs behind of cognitive restructuring, which is one cognitive therapy approach, I highly recommend you to read this excellent review published in Trends in Cognitive Science. So this journal is from Cell Press, which is the publisher group of the Cell magazine, one of the top scientific journals in the world. So this is a very reliable journal, right? And the type of this research is cognitive theory and therapy of anxiety and depression, convergence with neurobiological findings. So this review was actually written by David Clark and Aaron Beck. And the authors here, they discussed that the effectiveness of cognitive therapy is associated with reduced activation of certain regions of our brain, implicating the generation of negative emotions that I previously mentioned. So, and increase the activation of other regions of the brain involved in cognitive control of negative emotions. And more recently, it was actually now published in January this year, in this distinguished research released in the Molecular Psychiatry, which is a journal from Nature Publishing Group. So, as you can see here, also another reliable study for our references. And the title of this research is A Thalamus-Centric Neurosignature for Restructuring Negative Self-Beliefs. So basically the authors here, they found specific areas of the brain that are involved in the cognitive restructuring of negative self-beliefs, and also provided great insights in the mechanistic changes that neural networks may undergo during these psychotherapeutic interventions like cognitive therapy. So science here is actually revealing here neuroanatomic structures and psychological processes that are underlying the biology of cognitive restructuring that supports its effectiveness as a coping mechanism. All right? Another coping mechanism that I want to highlight here that you might find very interesting is the problem avoidance. So some studies here, they have shown that it was a frequent coping strategy during the pandemics. And for some people, it might have provided good results, and it actually provided me with good results. It refers to focusing on certain tasks to avoid thinking about a stressful situation or conflict, or conflicts like war. And a very good example of this is to not listen, for example, too often to negative news, or even to reduce the time allocated for social media to communicate, since this is actually the time when everyone is struggling with the same problem. So they might have a significant impact on your mood. So if you go too often to social media to participate and engage in negative discussions, it sort of creates a self-sustaining looping of negative emotions. But to what degree this is really unhealthy? Is there any scientific evidence that constant negativity in social media does any harm to the well-being of our mental health? So this is another paper recently published in Humanities and Social Science Communication. So it's a scientific magazine from the Nature Publishing Group. So also another reliable journal here. And the title of this research work is Anxiety, Gender, and Social Media Consumption Predict COVID-19 Emotional Distress. So this article is a quantitative analysis on the factors that contributed to increased emotional distress regarding the pandemics. The authors found in a sample of 948 participants during the early stages of the pandemic that social media consumption, among other factors, but social media is a significant predictor of increasing emotional distress. So the authors in this research, they sort of probed media consumption and general COVID-19 behaviors by asking participants which social media they used to get their COVID-19 news, such, for example, Facebook, Twitter, government resources, and television, etc. And how often they consumed the news, so they could rank the consumption of news in a scale of 1 to 5. And 5 would be a great deal. So the scientists evaluated here which individuals experienced the most distress in the early stages of the pandemic. So they found in this study that people high in anxiety, liberal-leaning, intolerant to uncertainty, they are the ones absorbing large amounts of COVID-19 media, mostly from Facebook and Twitter. So they are the most vulnerable to experiencing increased emotional distress. And the study also highlights that these observations were more strongly found in women. And they also found that the anxiety trait exerts the strongest influence on emotional distress and is almost 3 times more predictive than any other variable in this study. So what is particularly interesting in this study is the media platform by which information was collected as an instrument to influence distress levels. For example, government media sources did not contribute to emotional distress at all, but social network platforms such as Facebook and Twitter and also television watching were uniquely linked with higher emotional distress levels. So another article also that I want to highlight here, actually I briefly mentioned in the beginning of the podcast. It was published in the journal Science Advances, which I briefly mentioned. So the title of this research is Media Exposure to Mass Violence Events Can Fuel a Cycle of Distress. This is a very interesting one. The fundamental findings of this research is that distress response to large-scale traumas, such as, for example, terror attacks or bombing and war, may sensitize some individuals to media coverage of collective tragedies, which empowers a cycle of distress. So the findings of this research suggest that exposure to repeated trauma-related media coverage may lead some individuals to become more vulnerable to mental health consequences. For example, flashbacks and intrusive memories, and in a similar fashion that happens with collective accumulated traumas over time, which uncovers worries on the fact that this cycle of sensitivity to distress may also contribute to a prolonged physiological stress response that increases the risk for stress-related diseases. Acute stress response following a terror attack have also been associated with an increased incidence of cardiovascular diseases over time, even among individuals who were not directly exposed to the attack. So, this cycle of media exposure and distress appears to have a downstream implication to public health, and we need to be aware of this. You need to be diligent and careful with the level of media exposure or media consumption that you have. So instead of having an immediate response to uncertainty by going to social media and engaging in negativity with a low capacity to use, for example, a vocabulary that represents cognition of the problem, but rather a self-sustaining growth in reading and writing anxiety-provoking texts, maybe a better attitude would be trying to do something else, like just talking about something else, or watching a show, for example, or trying to be distracted with other things. And even if your impulsive desires are driving you towards the news or to talk constantly about the same problem, just pose the question to yourself. Is it really effective? What's my circle of influence? What I can really impact? This has a lot to do with personality, actually. The contagious capacity of social media is maximized amongst people that are temperamentally susceptible or easily manipulated, which is a feature that is highly associated with a high openness personality trait. And as described by Donald Wislow-Fiske, the big 5 broad personality traits, which are extroversion, agreeableness, openness, conscientiousness, and neuroticism. So people who tend to be high in the trait of openness, they are more willing to embrace new things, fresh ideas, and novel experiences. So for someone that is high in openness, it is often hard for this person to catalyze and specify an identity. And he or she is more diverse in his or her inner life, including emotional life. And it seems to be an addictive curiosity. And what's happening? Let me check what's happening. And at least I try to put myself away from that looping, especially from the TV news, because it is a similar thing and in a very concentrated form, actually, especially on the occasion of a pandemic or war. It has been good for me, at least, to some degree. So this is a form of problem avoidance. You avoid what is toxic to you, right? You don't need to access negative news every day, especially because news, it is only important today. And highly likely that is not as important tomorrow or or for the rest of the week. So why bother? So why not have access to the news in a less frequent manner, or perhaps by the end of the week have access to a summary of what's happening and what is absolutely relevant you keep with. And then by doing so, you reduce the amount of exposure, media exposure to negativity, because it's mostly what we are finding today, nowadays. And everyone is talking about this, like what is the consumption process. And the more you expose yourself to that, it will affect the structure of your emotions. So that will bring cumulative damage to your nervous system and also gradually and programmatically affect your physical and mental health. You don't want that. It doesn't mean that you're completely avoiding the problem, but you also get you get the information, but you don't get the problem or the poison every day, right? And another thing I would like to consider here is to make room for wishful thinking. And this is also a coping strategy that has been working for many, many people. It also works for me quite well and people from my community. So by definition, wishful thinking is the manifestation or the desire that the situation would disappear, or at least a miracle would happen. And for example, the act of faith, wishing that everything will be okay, or even prayer, and even more powerful, believing that this is actually going to happen, this is actually going to turn into something very good. So if you master this variable, you are less likely to be vulnerable to the problem, even if the problem persists. So you can realize here some sort of connection between wishful thinking and cognitive restructuring that I previously mentioned, and especially if you develop the ability to pose questions that bring you new positive perspective for hope, which can only help you to catalyze even more the negative aspect of the situation and also materialize a positive perspective in a cognitive manner that favors faith and also drives hope. So you might well think that, okay, this is some sort of a biological engine that you are talking about that we have to protect us, but religious people confound this with a divine power over ourselves. Well, I wouldn't be so sure about that, because it is counterintuitive to conceive that, at least in a scientific perspective, that evolution would contribute to develop a biological engine that works with the possible existence of an external influence. The more actually we go deep in the science of this topic, the more it's possible to find some correlation for a possible I would say intelligent design, which in turn poses bigger challenge to skeptical thinking. For example, this article that was recently published in Nature Communications, okay? So again, this is a very reliable journal. It is published from the Nature Publishing Group that also publishes Nature. So it's extremely good journal and reliable. And the title of this research is Placebos Without Deception Reduce Self-Report and Neural Measures of Emotional Distress. So this prestige research showed for the first time that the ability to develop wishful thinking can indeed impact how you control your biology, and in this case here, how you can control negative distress. So the authors here, they evaluated the placebo effect, which is the phenomenon when one's physical or mental health appears to improve after taking a placebo, or let's say a dummy treatment, right? So virtually, this treatment is not supposed to have a mechanistic effect, as opposed to the original drug that should target a particular receptor or cell, right? So in this situation, the person is not informed that they are receiving the placebo, but they take part in the study, imagining that they could have received the correct treatment, and in some cases, a person receiving this placebo will reach some treatment benefits, even if it's not the real drug. So the common belief about the benefits behind the placebo effect is that the person needs to be deceived into believing that they are taking an active treatment, right? And in this perspective, the scientists start to evaluate whether the beneficial effects of placebo can be harnessed without deception, or literally without deceiving the patient, for instance, by communicating to the participant what placebos are explaining the science behind how they work, and most importantly, highlighting how placebos can still provide beneficial effects even if people know that they are taking them. So this verbal suggestion approach actually anchors one of the primary psychological mechanisms through which placebos could work, which is the person's expectations that their condition can really improve, even after receiving a placebo drug. So informed placebos are called in this situation non-deceptive placebos, okay? And this research here, the scientists found that non-deceptive placebos significantly decreased self-reports of emotional distress during the time that they received the placebo, which is in accordance with previous studies also in the literature showing the same effect but without statistical significance. So the interpretation of these findings would be that this could be correlated with increased expectations and beliefs from these people. But this is not often shown, as I mentioned, with statistical significance, and also not in this study here in Nature Communications Journal. So, because these associations between expectation and outcome measures, they are not commonly documented and observed. And the reason why is due to a well-established finding that people frequently lack direct access to internal states, making it more difficult to provide an accurate account on their expectations. So it's not easy to measure that in order to get statistic accuracy. So in the past literature, only around, I would say, 8 studies included objective behavioral and biological measures, and only 1 study has actually shown a significant effect on behavioral outcome, but no study so far has shown a significant direct impact of beliefs and expectations on biological outcomes. But in this study here, the authors confirmed for the first time the self-report of less emotional distress in the context of informed placebo with a correlation with a neurobiomarker of emotional distress, so a biological response now, which is called, in the test that they performed, it's called late positive potential, or LPP. Essentially, the LPP is a test based on the voltage fluctuations recorded on the scalp of a visual cortical area in our brains, which fluctuates in accordance with emotional instability. And that could be a picture that you see, for example, that is supposed to evoke a positive or a negative emotion. So if a person reports less emotional distress given to an informed placebo, and this person indeed had lower voltage fluctuation in the cortical area of the brain. So the ultimate benefit of this report is not merely a product of responsive bias by just the self-report, but it represents actually a genuine psychobiological effect that has a location in the brain, meaning that we do have a biological engine that responds to a system grounded on expectations and beliefs, right? This was published in Nature Communications. So it is easy to assume here that, okay, so this that you are talking about is it's just a biological mechanistic explanation for the fact that faith or expectations could induce, or even beliefs could induce positive outcomes by themselves, regardless of the precondition of real external force or influence of a creator, for example. However, I want also to provide you with an additional perspective here, which is the fact that the evolution process is supposed to work in a sense that the necessity of existing natural factors that provides pressure for selection in the context of genetic variability. Meaning that if this is an evolutionary process, you do need to have an existing factor that promotes this selection. So why we would have evolved to the degree that we would have developed this biological sensor that responds to faith and expectation, which is genetically coordinated, by the way, to operate in response to something that never existed or some external forces that is not realistic. For example, for a superior power to impulse this selection. It doesn't make sense, right? So probably this particular part of our biology isn't a product of a natural evolution, perhaps, not in its totality, perhaps. It could be a product of an intelligent design to respond to something that is transcending. So this is a question that I pose here in the podcast, and we can even open for discussions. But these are questions that we cannot answer with the current scientific knowledge and instrumentation that we have today. But at least the science that we have now, that we have today, is enough to show and prove that we do have a biological sensor that responds to wishful thinking. And also, this can indeed help us to reduce the impact of acute episodes of emotional distress, which have relevance for many, many aspects in our daily emotional life, and physical and psychiatric condition as well. So bear in mind, all these three main, I would say, coping mechanisms, they have scientific grounded science to support that they can actually work to reduce psychological distress in our lives. I hope that this podcast could help you to better understand many aspects of our biology that by itself might already impact and reduce fear to the unknown, and also to provide you with the tools that can really help you to reduce the impact of negative emotions on different circumstances that normally have a negative aspect on our health, particularly to our immunity, and its consequence also to infection and chronic disease such as cancer. Also remember the tips in this podcast that can help you to better control your sympathetic nervous system, especially respecting the light and dark cycles in the day, so you preserve the dynamics of the circadian rhythm that controls your sympathetic nervous system, okay? So mastering this important information from the circadian rhythm, and also how to control your emotional response to the circumstances in life could really impact your immunity, so you take care of the dynamic physiological process that will reconstitute the amount of immune cells in your body to prevent you from infectious disease and even cancer, okay? If you are not already following Medical Science Reviews on Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, please do so to support our initiative. And we also have a homepage, by the way. It's medicalsciencereviews.com, where I'm hosting most of the podcasts and also expanding the interconnected social links. So I teach in Instagram, I teach immunology together with YouTube, where I also post immunology courses and the podcast content. And also bringing some short clips about health-related topics sometimes, but not always overlapping with the content of the podcast. Thank you for your interest in medical sciences.